Hello, everybody. How are you doing? My name is Mehdi, and welcome to another episode of Quack and Code, where we do Quack and then spend a bit more time on the typing on the keyboard, coding. And today we have an interesting topic. I wanted to dive in around SQL spaghetti. I'm sure a lot of data folks has issue with it, and the goal basically today is kind of to see what is possible in terms of fixing SQL, not really the language, but like long SQL script. And I have a special guest with me today, always, because I always need a copilot. GitHub Copilot is not enough. I need a human copilot. And so I have Lindsay, which is with me right there. Welcome, Lindsay.
Hello, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, we're super happy to have you. We have already a few comments of people saying that their worst nightmare is actually recursive joins around SQL. And we're gonna dive maybe not recursive joins, but other things.
It's a deep topic.
But first, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah. So I'm Lindsey Murphy. I'm the head of data at a company called Sakoda, and I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you might see me posting on there quite a bit. I also have a weekly podcast called Women Lead Data. Yeah, I've been working in data for about 13 years now, so I was a
Oh,
individual
wow.
contributor for many years. Yeah, and moved into leadership roles over the past few years. And my head of data role, I'm a data team of one, so I set up our internal infrastructure and manage things all by myself. I have some help from another team member at Sakoda as well, but yeah, manage our DBT project, build out our infrastructure, our BI tool, all that good stuff.
I like that data team of one. Can you bit like, because you use that naming, and I think it's really good to give a good grasp on like what kind of task you are doing given the size of the team,
Mhm.
right? But can you maybe elaborate a bit more for people that doesn't really picture, or people that never been in a team of one, right? They've always been with other people.
Yeah. I've actually done it a few times now, and I've done that first data hire role a few times. So usually, if you are a team of one, you probably are the first hire. So yeah, it's a really, I think it's a very big opportunistic role. Like it's definitely a good role for people to grow into and kind of show your value. Don't make the mistake I did and go into that role too early. I joined a company where I was the first data hire, and I would say I was like mid-stage career at that point, and so I found it like it's a little hard because you're kind of alone, and if you don't have community, you're learning things on your own, and it can be a bit challenging. So it's definitely a really exciting and interesting role. Like one day to the next, you could be doing something totally different, like choosing which tools you want to use and building your infrastructure versus actually building models and doing insights and all kinds of different things. So it's really good to kind of like hone your skills in a full stack role. But you have to get really good at prioritization. You have to get really good at pushing back, and you have to also know, when do you hit that point where you're not really seeing the forest for the trees anymore, and you're like so in the weeds that you can't really plan the next, 3 to 6 months. That's when you need to start hiring a team, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's I'm just curious there. It's not the main topic, but how do you
Yeah.
manage prioritization on a team of one? Because like this is, I think you said like something that resonated with me, like learning to say no. But
Mhm.
maybe can you give your thoughts a bit on that?
Yeah, it's definitely hard, and I won't claim to have it all figured out by any means. But we do 2 weeks sprint cycles at Sakoda, and so we do like I try to save like longer term planning for quarterly, and then we break things down into cycles. And within that, I try to stay on a cycle as much as I can. Stuff always comes up, especially in a fast paced startup. So you kind of just have to get good, I think, at understanding, what's urgent and important versus the stuff that just feels really urgent and important. And then I think the biggest thing I would say is like don't let back burner issues fester for too long. And if Cam from Sakoda is listening, like it's like things that we want to get to, but like we haven't gotten to, and then you kind of wait for it to become a really big problem. I think those are the things that sometimes when you're a team of one can be hard to get your time into. But as much as possible, try not to let those issues go for too long, because then they'll become bigger problems for you later on.
Yeah, no, that's true. Another thing I wanted to ask you, the just because you went to the Snowflake Summit, like before that, it was the SQL refactoring topic. What is your main highlights? And have you been to the SQL Snowflake Summit last year?
Yeah, I was at the
Ah,
one last
so
year in
I'm
Vegas.
curious
Yeah.
to hear your highlights of this year, and what is the drastic change you've seen compared to last year?
Yeah, that's a good question. I should caveat by saying both last year and this year, I didn't make it to any sessions. So I feel like my experience is like totally on the vendor floor and just like
I've been
talking to
there. I've
people.
been
Yeah,
there.
yeah. Like I find Snowflake Summit's a little harder actually for folks if they haven't been. It's like kind of harder to get into sessions. Like you have to sign up beforehand and then they fill up
Oh,
really quickly. So it's a little bit of a different conference format. So I feel like last year I didn't really learn that until too late. So I think I made it to like one session, and then this year I didn't even make it to any. But I think I've been noticing a little bit of this conversation online, and I kind of noticed this as well, as like there's kind of this divide in the world of like AI. It's like there's a lot of vendors and tools out there that are going like full force ahead into adding AI into their product and trying to get as much value out of it and pushing it and saying that and thinking that it's really important, versus maybe the tools that kind of don't feel it's as valuable, or the data people who are more skeptical about it. And I feel like
yeah,
we're still kind of in this like there's like this weird polarity of it, where some people are really bought in and then others maybe aren't. So yeah, I think that's kind of, we're still seeing that play out at a lot of conferences.
yeah.
And then I
I,
think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no. I mean, I totally agree. I feel like the next year will probably break or make it year for
Yeah,
AI and
for
see.
sure.
But I think like the challenge is that the AI risk came at the downturn economy. I mean, not really for AI, but like data team were pushed on budget, and so I think it's kind of like created a mess. I was at the conference this week, the Berlin Buzzword, which is a search data conference in Berlin, and a lot of people say like that, like roadmap have been completely changed
Yeah.
with the AI, but they're not sure it was really worth it. I don't know if you have the same feeling.
Yeah, yeah, I do kind of feel like there's like it's kind of this everybody, the hype cycle word that we use a lot, but like it kind of feels like we're in like the frenzy of it, where everybody's reallocating budget and prioritization to AI projects. So yeah, I think it's definitely and there I think there was a lot more people that I spoke to, especially who are looking for jobs or who are kind of in like the transition
Hmm.
of a role or something like that, which definitely I think there was a little bit less of last year, or maybe we hadn't quite gotten there yet. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think it's definitely a strange time in the industry, but I'm sure that we'll see it come out in the wash in the next 12 months. I'm sure next year will be very different.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm curious if your roadmap has been changed because of AI. Please leave a
Mm.
message and tell us if you're if you're convinced or not, because I think we are not the only one. So going now on the main topic, which is SQL spaghetti. I like to use this expression. Did you use this expression, or how do you refer like bad long long script SQL?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we probably I would just call it a mess sometimes. It's like a model that it's like it's like only you and God know what it does sometimes. When it's like you don't really understand how it works anymore. It's like
Yeah.
when you go in there, you just kind of want to shut the door and get back out. I don't know if there's a word for that, but it's like a bad feeling.
And so, did you had the experience on refactoring like significant chunk in the past, like SQL, and how did that happen?
Yeah, when I joined Sakoda, we went through a bit of a migration. So we were on a Postgres warehouse previous, and we moved over to Snowflake. Mostly because we just wanted to practice using Snowflake, not because I think we necessarily needed to at our stage yet. But many of our customers are Snowflake users, so we wanted to really get a good handle on the tool ourselves. But I think moving some of our legacy code over into DBT core and into Snowflake, there was some refactoring there, and then there was a project at my last company where one person on my team, I was kind of overseeing them, and they were doing the refactoring, and so then I was doing
Yeah.
the code review, and so we were kind of both caught up in this refactoring nightmare, and that was like a really pretty challenging project. Log files that were supposed to be log files, and then turns out that they weren't really logs. They were a little bit different, and yeah, a lot of conversations back and forth with the engineering team to understand that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that we haven't. I mean, we have a couple of tips to discuss pragmatically how to refactor SQL, but at the very end, you also kind of playing the detective because probably the person that writes this SQL is not there anymore. It's often like that. But what is your feeling about that or your experience?
Yeah, I think that was a couple things where we learned, like, in a past role that, someone had left the company who had written the code, and it was like, okay, we thought this was well documented, but then when you really start to go into it and that person's not there anymore and you can't ask questions, you sort of realize we don't actually know what this person was thinking or what they were doing at this point. And so that's, I think, the hard lesson you might learn of not documenting your code very well. And even for myself, like, I've written code before that I come back and look at 6 months later, and I'm like, I don't understand what that does anymore. I don't remember what I was
And
thinking.
it's a good reflection, like to yourself. It's like don't document for other people because people say I don't like documentation. Think just about yourself, like coming back. And it's the documentation, the setup, how to reproduce. But yeah, it's true that a part of refactoring pipeline, because here we basically gonna talk about SQL itself, right? But as part of refactoring pipeline is understanding, how you touch down on the source of the data. Is it the best, appropriate way to do it? And for that you need, as you mentioned, like really put your detective hat and and go talk to people. Yeah, I see a comment from Colleen. The code is the documentation.
Yeah, so true.
but yeah, and I think like this is actually even harder when column names are not explicit. Like if you see source database. If a few folks in the audience work with SAP database, or you've been, I'm not sure what's the status to now, but I've been like a couple of years back, and column name are purely technical. They doesn't mean anything, and so if you don't have any documentation on that, that's rubbish. It's like
for sure.
So yeah, and so when do you think? So you've been talking to basically to teams and how the data is being fed to the pipeline is important as part of refactoring. But now focusing, zooming on SQL itself, when do you feel it's the time to refactor? What kind of signs do you see that give you a hinge to refactor a SQL pipeline?
Yeah, there can definitely be a couple different scenarios. I think the one that I mentioned before would have been like we were migrating to a different tool. So we were previously, someone was building in Postgres and they were kind of just like rerunning views whenever they needed a query. But we wanted to move to dbt and then move to Snowflake. So in that, it was like, we could have just lifted and shifted the queries and probably been relatively successful. But then you want to adopt best practices for dbt and start to like break the models down into component pieces. And so that's kind of one example, I think, is like, if you're doing a database or a data warehouse migration and then also moving to something like dbt, like that would be definitely a scenario. Another one could be, if it's a performance thing, and we talked a little bit about this beforehand, but it's like, it's not necessarily that you're like trying to get like a model down totally optimized, but it might be that model is like a bottleneck in your whole pipeline. So in my last company, oftentimes these bottlenecks tend to be kind of like the core concept of the business. And so at my last company, we had a model called consults, and it was like basically every single model in the company, it seemed like, went into that model, and then, or like every single data source, not every single one, but a lot of them. And then all of our core reporting came out of that model. It was like very, very important to the business. And so for that model to not function well, kind of just slowed like everything down and made everything perform not as well. So that was one that, we had to think about refactoring, and also pretty high stakes. And then the last one is probably more when it's like, your code isn't really readable, or your formatting is off, or things are just not really easily usable for your team. So if things, maybe you've got the same concepts in like multiple places in your DBT project, you might want to think about refactoring some of that to kind of bring some efficiency. You can improve the performance of the whole pipeline, but you can also just make it easier to read so that future you or the rest of your team
Yeah.
is not afraid to kind of like go in and touch anything, and just have it be very difficult to actually work with the project.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I can resonate, and I can do an analogy because I'm moving apartments, and uh, when you move apartments or houses, it's the best time to clean up, right? It's
It's
like
true.
you
Yeah.
sort things like I don't need this, or maybe I can optimize this, and it's the same when you migrate to a different database or you use another tool. So you have to do some work of moving things around anyway. So it's the best opportunity to revisit things. Um, and then, yeah, the second, like as you mentioned, I start to think, I think losing velocity. And I said, like you were mentioning team of one and hiring. I think I've been also in a team of one, not data, actually, yeah, data team like shortly. And but also when I have a new hire in my team, the first thing I do is going through the documentation to like, how
Yeah.
can this one be, as fast as possible, up to speed, and help me out, basically, but my will, and so I go back to the documentation, and it's all a question of velocity of people contributing to the pipelines or yourself, but also new people, right, joining your team,
Yeah.
and
That's a great
so
point.
yeah, and so at that point it's better for them to jump on that. We have a few comments here. Eva saying, getting more people applying for analytics job and think it's AI, and with some prompt course, they can actually do analytics. We're gonna talk about that, or maybe we can talk about it right now. Do you need actually to do how to do refactoring now that we have ChatGPT and other things?
Yeah, I had a friend message me when they saw that we were doing the session, and they were like, AI can just fix your spaghetti SQL for you. And I was like, listen, sure, it probably can do a lot of that, but you still, as a person, I think it's the same with any type of coding. Like if someone doesn't really know what they're doing and they just start asking AI to do all of this for them, you're probably going to have a bad time. It's probably going to turn out to either be inaccurate, or things aren't necessarily going to be set up exactly the way you want. That's not to say that AI can't help you and speed things up. Like, I think with some very rigorous prompt engineering and some good conventions and guidelines on what you want to do, I think it can probably help out with a lot of that. But you still want to kind of have like a basic framework of how you want to think about it.
Yeah.
Because at this point, right now, I'm sure this will change over the next 12 months and 5 years or whatever. But AI still needs a lot of guidance from humans to be able to like do things properly and do a good job of it.
Yeah.
So if you don't really know what you're doing and you're trying to get AI to help you, then you're probably going to come out poorer on the other side. My answer might be different in a couple of years, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, and I think something that AI will still miss, like for a long, long time, is enough context. So business context, right?
Yeah.
So you can say, yeah, oh, but if AI knows the business, yeah, but who feed the business context? Who feed that? What's the definition of a customer? So that's a human, like, because the customer like has a different definition in different company, right?
Yeah.
So I think because of that, there is also a good opportunity for people to go, a bit more into kind of business and some of the technical part to say, make that code more readable or split that SQL query into multiple queries. That would be, helpful to and down to any AI. But again, you need to know what you do, and business context needs to what's the I'm curious, what's the worst situation you had with like business understanding when writing SQL?
Oh, there's probably so many of them. It's like there's probably so many situations where I've just that I probably have blocked out of my memory, to be honest. But I think it's more about like it's understanding the business, but then it's also understanding the nuances of the data in your business, because a lot of times like how the data is collected and who's collecting it matters a lot. A lot of times like engineering teams are obviously responsible for building production databases, and so they're they're thinking about how to build the data to service a product,
Yeah.
not to service analytics most of the time. And so the analytics team is then just going and taking that data that's available and using it however we see fit for downstream purposes. But that goes back to that like data contracts and data producers and consumers conversation is like, if they don't know how we're using the data and we can't really communicate to them about, this is what we need and we can't have these things change.
Yeah.
I think that is a lot of like business understanding and then also data collection understanding and then agreements with data producers that often goes overlooked. And I think those have probably been the biggest headaches for me. I'm sure most people on the call.
Yeah, share with us if you have
Hmm.
what are your challenge when understanding basically source data when writing your SQL query, and if you have some pain with understanding the business concept, and how did you solve that? Yeah, that's also because I feel like at the end it's always just talking to people. That's what I
Yeah.
found horrible. Like by default, I don't really like people, so uh, so it's like talking to them. Like, if it's the default solution, that's a
Yeah.
bit scary. Uh, but yeah, I'm getting PTSD with this conversation. Yeah, Anthony. I mean,
I
I
like that
know,
comment.
I know what you feel. Um, so let's go. So we talked about when to refactor, and now the question is basically what to refactor on the SQL query, and you've prepared a couple of slides. Do you want to jump on those?
Sure. Share my
Um,
screen.
I can share
Oh,
directly.
you got them? Okay,
Just leave me.
perfect.
I'm not. I'm just. I'm gonna share it also with the chat if you want to follow along. So just a couple of notes and practice, and after we'll uh, dive into the codes. And let me share. And I'm not sure which sharing screen, because I've been traveling, so my setup for live stream have been changing. Let me just.
I was on
Let me
vacation for
share.
2 weeks and I was surprised that I remembered the password to my laptop. It's always the worst when you get back and you're like, you've had a good vacation when you need IT to reset your password for a computer.
Yeah. I know what you mean. So let me just. I'm gonna display this. It's a live fix. You see, that's a live fix. That's a live fix right there. Say everything is live. No cheating. No, you know that it's not recorded, right? We are not.
Yeah,
We are
exactly.
we are
This
being
is live.
honest with you. Right. All right. So why refactor code? We have been talking, but I'll let you talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, we touched on this already, but I think, like you said, like the biggest one is, if you're like moving your house or your apartment or whatever, you're moving to a new tool, you're moving to a new warehouse, that's a really good time to think about refactoring your code because in some cases you might have to. There might be, if you're moving from Postgres, SQL to Snowflake, some of the functions don't work, and so you're gonna have to rewrite some SQL anyway. But then also, maybe you're going from stored procedures to DBT. That would be, a pretty big migration, a pretty big change. But you want to be, thinking about adopting best practices as you're moving to these new tools, and using them in ways that are they're kind of designed for.
Yeah.
The second one we talked about was code performance, and I guess that's more like, it could be like a specific model that's degraded, and that was the model neck. I think Jeremy Cohn from DBT came up with that term, but it's like a model in your whole DBT project that becomes a very big bottleneck, and that can kind of slow down the whole system. But it also could be, maybe something worked well before, but now there's a lot more source data flowing into a model, and you need to think about improving the performance, and that could for refactoring could help that, or it could be other methods, maybe moving to an incremental model, something else like that if you're using DBT. And then the spaghetti DAG, which is really more of just like, your kind of projects become a bit of a mess. It's a little hard to navigate. Maybe the documentation's gotten out of date. Maybe there's models that nobody really knows how they work anymore, and you want to just go in and fix those up.
Yeah. And so that's a good point that we mentioned earlier. Like, sometimes we discuss about SQL optimization, I mean, optimization of queries in general and refactoring, and those two can be done together. But I feel like for me, refactoring in my mind is make the code, more readable and maintainable, which increase the productivity and velocity, no matter, how efficient it touchdown after the database, which join are you using? Are you filtering on an index or whatsoever? And I think you can also refactor code just for optimization. That's completely true if your performance is degrading. But yeah, that's basically, I feel like at least in my mind, I'm curious to hear in the audience if you have different definition on optimization and refactoring. Refactoring can be done for optimization, but in my mind, it's often like the easy way is just to start refactoring some piece and just making more readable and maintainable. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do kind of feel like there's like a tricky side of it where I feel like you want to separate those two things sometimes as well. Like, because if you start to refactor something and then you kind of go down to the performance issue or like
Yeah,
trying
exactly.
to all these other things, then you
Yeah.
kind of get sidetracked of like your original goal.
Yeah.
And then your PR is going to get really big. It's going to get very hard to figure out what you're doing. So definitely, yeah, I think maybe the motivations for refactoring, and then also just determining like, are you working on performance or are you working more on formatting and readability and maintainability? Yeah, those are different things for sure.
Yeah, so you have a couple of best practice here.
Yeah, so and I will say some of these I definitely have borrowed from working more with DBT, and so at least the best practices that DBT recommends and ones that I've found have worked really well in my experience is a couple of them. The first one is kind of this, they call it, like DBT calls it, an alongside strategy rather than an in place, and simply what that means is that you would duplicate either, in the previous example where I mentioned we were moving from Postgres to Snowflake and we were bringing things over into DBT. I brought the model over, the SQL query over exactly as it was, and just created a model called like legacy, whatever the name of the model was. And then I made a copy of it and I started working on the copy. And so the purpose of doing that is so that you would then be able to compare, the previous state with the new refactored state. And so it allows for a lot easier QA. And then, when you're finished with that, if you have downstream dependencies like BI tools or other things that are connected to that model, you can just kind of cut over the source. And hopefully that's not too difficult in whatever tool you're using. But that is a generally pretty, I guess I would say maybe a more conservative or a safer strategy that, will probably save you some QA time, but it might make it a little bit more difficult to do that cut over at the end, depending on how many things are connected to that model.
Yeah. But I think it's like, that's one of the things when you refactor, you don't want to break things, right? So I think duplicating model is often like the thing I've seen happening so far. Yeah.
Makes sense. And then the next one is, and this is like maybe controversial for people who like subqueries, but CTEs are usually, common table expressions are usually quite a lot more readable. And so if you've got, I've worked with a lot of queries that have been like nested subqueries, and it's very difficult to conceptually understand what's going on when you start to get layers of more than a few layers into a nested subquery, even like one layer, in my opinion. And so breaking those out into CTEs can make it a lot more readable. And you can even then, if you name your CTEs very well, then it makes it very clear of like, this piece of the code does this, and this is the name that I gave that. And so, I see a lot of times people will still write like A is the name of the CTE, or B or C or whatever, or make them not very clear. And so I think just being very clear on, not just using CTEs, but then using names to really explain what you're doing and making it super readable.
No. Formatting, that's one is easy.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing about formatting is choosing conventions and then like actually sticking with
lowercase, uppercase.
Yeah,
use for lowercase and uppercase in the chat. Let's start the war. Let's start the war.
And leading commas.
Let's start the war for a second.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
with for uppercase or lowercase. I'm just checking quickly the comments. Yeah, so we just had a comment on YouTube. Since more users going into the data sphere, I think it's important to also think about refactoring as creating good abstraction that outsider can easily grasp. Yeah, definitely. That's very true. And also CTEs are a reflection of your mind, organized.
Yeah.
Yeah, very true, Anthony.
I don't know how organized my mind is, Anthony, but I try.
But yeah, and so let's just go back. I was quickly catching up. Yeah, so last one, modeling layer.
Yeah, this one is definitely for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with tools like DBT. This I wasn't as familiar with this before I started using DBT, and so this is really the concept of like separating your transformations into more of a pipeline. So kind of separating, having a staging layer where you land your data, and that's just kind of like a copy of your raw data, and you might do some light cleanup, renaming of columns, that type of stuff. But you're not really doing like heavy transformations in that layer. It's really just meant to be kind of like a connection to your data source. The intermediate layer where you might need to do, if you need to do a pivot or you need to kind of do some things that might get reused in multiple places, that can get pulled into an intermediate layer. And then the MART layer is really for the business user, like the end business concept of what you're trying to achieve. And so if you're doing dimensional modeling, that would be, fact and dimensional models most likely. But this would be, typically organized by maybe area of business. So in our project at Sakoda, I put models together that are like for the product team or for the marketing team or sales, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And so that kind of gives you the ability, instead of like having this like huge query where you're trying to, you're staging the data, you're doing pivots and transformations, and then you're also kind of preparing it for the MART layer. You're separating those out and then referencing them. So it kind of makes a nicer DAG from left to right if you're used to the DBT concept, rather than doing it all in one big set query.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. Things to watch out.
Yeah, we talked about this on the first slide, but avoiding major logic changes. So it's very hard sometimes, I find, when you refactor something and you're like, oh, I actually want to change this and I want to fix that, and this would be better to do it this way. It's better to save that stuff for later. So as much as possible, try to stick to the task at hand and think like, I'm refactoring, maybe I'm taking a really long model and I'm breaking it out into layers, or I'm fixing formatting or changing subqueries to CTEs. If you want to change how something's done, like a major logic change, to open up a Jira ticket or linear ticket or whatever, and come back to that when you're done. Because if you start going down that path at the same time you're doing refactoring, it's going to get pretty overwhelming pretty fast. And I've definitely made that mistake before.
Yeah. So it's true that you shouldn't, like, it's a common mistake with refactoring for anything. Don't get sidetracked. We talked about that, right? But like, if you need to fix something, don't say, I'm hitting this, so I'm gonna fix that, and then I'm gonna fix the initial thing I did, and then you're going to the rabbit hole. So scope it to, one thing, like I'm formatting, or I'm just, replacing all the type of joints to make it more effective. I don't know. But yeah, there is also a meme I shared a while back. I don't know. It's someone like trying to fix a light, and he goes to, where his tools are, and then find that to bring a new light, and then found out that the shelf is broken. So he started to fix the shelf. Then he started to see that he doesn't have the right tools, so he's going out to buy the tools to fix the shelf. So it's like the kind of thing, but it's really common in software engineering or refactoring to get sidetracked. So,
for sure.
So please don't. All right, we have around 20 minutes to start coding. So we prepared a project, so a simple repo. I'm gonna share the repo right now on both our YouTube folks. Failed to post comment, of course, SQL refactoring repo here. LinkedIn is being LinkedIn and doesn't want me to comment on the events. But you can, I'll put anyway after, let me try it. Yeah, it's gone. All right, so this is the repository. you can use a dev container. If you're not familiar, you can just open it in CodeSpace and you have the full environment ready. This is also one thing I always do when doing refactoring is that you need to have a development space, and this one should be easily reproducible, right? I think it's something that we haven't talked so far, but basically the way that you set up your development environment so that anyone can contribute, it's also important. Do you have a few thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think at least in my experience, I definitely don't have as much experience with the container situation, but setting up like a development environment in Snowflake, for example, we have our development warehouse, and then
Yeah.
so anything that we do locally in development is always built into that warehouse. In a perfect world, we would move over. I would love to play around with moving to Mother Duck, because obviously you do, when you have a development environment on tools like Snowflake or Redshift or whatever, like you're paying when you are doing testing in local. And so
Locally.
if anyone has followed my cost containment discussions, I'm pretty like cost sensitive as a data team of one at an early stage startup. So so shout out to Mother Duck for that. But essentially we have our dev warehouse, we have our production warehouse. And so anything that we're doing locally is always built into that development environment so that we can test it, we can play around with it. You can even compare that. Like if you wanted to compare a legacy query, output of a legacy query to your refactored query, you can do all of that before pushing to production.
Yeah. And we're gonna use like in the example I'm using dbt and DuckDB because again it's great to have a local development environment working. You're not paying, especially for just the sake of the example here. So basically here I have this long SQL spaghetti, right? There is a couple of subqueries, right? And we're saying like, you're not like using AI for refactoring. You need to know what you want, right? Well, I asked AI to generate me an ugly query. It was pretty easy. It did that pretty well. So, who knows the data is being trained out. Anyway, so this is the first query. It's not too long. And so the first thing that we want to do basically probably is formatting, right? So you mentioned a few tools. What do you usually use?
So I usually use SQL Fluff personally for getting things to a state that fit my conventions. And I like that. I know there's a lot of SQL IDs that have like a button that you just press and it will just change the SQL to whatever you want. But in my experience, that's not super customizable. So with SQL Fluff, if anyone's heard of that, you can set up your own SQL Fluff file, configuration file, and that, then you determine like, what are my conventions? And then how do I set up SQL Fluff in a way that will enforce that? So makes it
so readability first to refactor is important. And I just wanted to share that image, and I'll share also the blog, which is a really great blog to read about refactoring. And DBT also has a lot of resource output after, but this image, because I've seen that in person, people printing SQL query. So this is a huge SQL query, all right? This is before AI, not generated. Someone write this. And so you need to have a visibility to be able to start, to make the piece together and like building CTE. That's what we're gonna do. So SQL Fluff is a really great tool. You were mentioning IDE. Actually, there is a lot of IDE that has the extension that supports SQL Fluff. So VS Code has integrated SQL Fluff, so you can do format and you just have to configure it properly. And they support multiple dialects, right? You just need to put the dialect. So I'll use it manually just to show you. So you just do a pip install. I think I already installed it here, but you just do a pip install SQL Fluff, right? And then you're gonna do, you have different things in SQL Fluff. Let me just increase that. So you can format and lint. So it's gonna give you error suggestion if you break the convention. So this is also, we're saying like formatting things is easy, right? But you could defining the linting rule and saying, yeah, we allow like, that much length in the SQL and etc. So this is, you can actually define those rules, and I think you should spend some time. You can use the default one, but you may not be happy at some point. So it's good to define those as well, as you mentioned. So if you just do SQL fluff, and then we're gonna do format, we're gonna do dialect, DuckDB, and we're gonna point to our file, I believe. It's not finding my file because it's just right there. Yep. And up, this is it. So that's much more already readable than one line. I pushed the things really hard with one line, but sometimes, when you exploring things and so on, you might get, like, depending on the interface, a query like that. Anyway, so now we have, what is this? I know you like this one.
Subqueries. I hate subqueries so much.
So we have subqueries. And we have a couple of join, and yeah. So basically, what would be your advice to move like from there? And let's say we start a simple DBT project.
Yeah. So the pattern that DBT usually recommends following is to sort of separate your query into what they call like import CTEs versus logic CTEs.
Okay.
And so in this case, like, I would probably identify all of the froms that I see, and I would move those into kind of each of their own import CTE. So I'd probably start with customers, maybe, or orders. Doesn't really matter in this case. And I'd move those into CTEs at the top first. And then we can kind of take some of those joins out and start to move some of that stuff around.
So the good news is that I already done that, but she doesn't know. Perfect. I wanted to know if I was a good student, But one thing maybe is we were talking about, duplicate or replace, right? So maybe for people not much comfortable with DBT, it's like, so what I did is create like a legacy folder, and I just put back the same query. Right, within DBT, and the only thing I did is basically specifying, my source with a source YAML file that define where those tables are. Because I feel like, I'm curious what your thoughts is. For some people that never touch DBT, it can be overwhelming with all the configuration, don't you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a learning curve. Like, for someone who wrote SQL for many years and then started using DBT, at first I was kind of like, what's going on here? But when you kind of realize, like, it's mostly just SQL, and you then have to understand, I think you have to understand a little bit more about variables and start to kind of understand like Python a little bit better. Not necessarily, I don't write Python very well at all, so you can definitely get by. But I think having those concepts in your mind about being more component focused and like object focused is definitely useful.
Yeah. And so here, basically, for those people not comfortable with DBT, but quickly, it's like we're just replacing the variable of the table name with a variable that we define in the source YAML. So it's referring to a specific source that point to a table. And that's Jinja template, if you're familiar with Python. So this is basically getting parsed after in the DBT engine and executing the final query. Something I want to touch on is that, are you familiar with the tpch extension on DuckDB? I'm not sure if you're familiar with DuckDB itself.
It's getting familiar, but
right.
Not as much.
So I'm getting just a bit sidetracked because I felt it was interesting. So I needed a new data set for this example. Let me go here. So I'm just at the root here. And I'm gonna launch DuckDB. And by the way, if you open the dev container, you have everything ready, right? DBT, DuckDB CLI, it's installed for you with just one click. So if you do DuckDB and then let's say I pass example DB, so it's gonna persist my example database over there. It's just what it is gonna do. So what's super nice with DuckDB is that they have an extension, tpch and tpcs for, so those data sets are used for benchmarking, and you can generate them pretty easily with a scale factor. So, so you just call dbgen, and the scale factor is basically how large you want your data set. So here it's gonna be, we're gonna try it out, but I think it's roughly like 100 megabytes or a bit less, and some tables gonna contain like a million rows. So it's done. And so now if I'm doing a show tables, I have all those tables that have been generated quickly. And if I do, let's do, so I count on from line item, like, yeah, we have roughly, a bit more than 1 million rows on that, right? And this is taking, yeah, okay, 50, a bit less than I expected, 150 megabytes, okay? So this is what I did for generating basically the example. So all the queries are based on the tpch dataset queries. And so this data set is actually there locally. So there is already a database there. It's a DuckDB database. It's a one file that contains all the tables. So that's also super cool, because if you think about refactoring, we were talking just before, you can also get a sample of all your data into one single file locally, and then you're ready to basically iterate and do all this refactoring mostly. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, it's awesome.
So yeah, coming back now, I sidetracked enough to the refactoring. So you mentioned, so I did this one, and so just replace and copy the legacy SQL. So as a reminder, what we did so far is that we linted using SQL fluff, and then copy paste it into here, replace the variable. So that's one first thing that you can see. Okay, everything is still working, and now I'm using a DBT project and my code is formatted. Next, what was next was to split it into CTE, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Or yeah, I guess in this case, like, so I guess it kind of depends if you're talking about modeling layers as well. Like if in the best case scenario, you would start with creating staging models. You don't really want to connect directly to sources usually in DBT unless it's in a staging model. So I think that's probably what you've got maybe on there on the right hand side.
No, I don't, because I was a bad student. I cannot be always a good student. That's the thing.
So you need to make your staging models first.
Okay, so so you would do like a staging folder, for example. And with a folder, not a file, right? That's not going to work otherwise. Yeah, of course you're not happy.
I do that like every single time.
So you have you have a staging folder, and you would start with like customer.
Yeah, I'd probably maybe start there first. Make a staging customer model, where you've got all of the, essentially where you have like customer key as customer ID, name as customer name. Like you would move all that into your staging model so that you only touch the source once, and then you're just doing all that renaming and formatting essentially in that first layer.
Okay, I see. So it's actually what it's funny, because this is what I'm really comfortable with, what Databricks called the medallion architecture, with bronze, silver, gold. But it's funny when using DBT and SQL, this is not like coming to me so naturally. I think it's because it's still SQL. Like typically, like in the bronze area, what you do is, or you have a landing zone where you don't touch a file and then you format just the file format usually to make it more efficient for read, like typically CSV to Parquet, so on. But so here in the staging area, you would say like renaming things basically and just selecting the columns that you need. That's roughly that.
Yeah, typically that. And then there might be some like light cleaning if there's things you want to remove, but usually you would save that until like the next layer potentially.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, so I'm not going to go in that, just summarizing what would be the takeaway. And so here we have another CTA. So for example, this one should probably, so you would create 3 staging area basically for each.
Yeah, I guess in this case there'd be 1, 2, 3, 4 models that I would create.
4.
Yeah, 4 staging models.
So 4 staging models and then the logic, and so here basically I kind of bypass that, but then there is just a with statement and a couple of joins, but each one has a bit less joins. So I basically split. If you look at here, those subqueries, right, are their own model. So we have the order details here, and so then we have the final one, which is relying on the customer details. So it's the order line details. And so I'm referring the other model here, which is the CTA, and that's the final data set that I want. That's roughly it. Like if you're coming back to what we say, of course you can do much more in terms of like, do you have any advice regarding joins? Like how do you tackle those?
Yeah, usually I try to do all of those near the end of the query if I can, unless there's like a requirement that, like if it's a performance thing or if there's something that I need to filter down before doing some kind of transformation. But typically, like I notice a lot of times people will join the same concept multiple times in a query. And it's like, if you just wait to do all the joins near the end, you're saving yourself. It should give you some performance gains, and it also just makes it a lot easier to read. You don't have to do things multiple times. So that's generally what I recommend.
Yeah. And so if you want to run the things, and by the way, also, we haven't touched that, but there is also now, DBT has an amazing feature for testing, which should help you refactoring and do those small testing case and validating. But basically, what you need to do after is just run a DBT run and in the right folder. So the SQL Ravioli is my DBT folder project, because Ravioli is a bit less mess than spaghetti, right? It's just like that. But I do love both, right? Eating those. But anyway, and so if you run DBT run target dev, you see that I'm pointing to the local database, right? Let me open quickly this database, which is in SQL Ravioli data tpch. So this is basically what we had, and you see you already have, this is the models. This is the different models. There is the source also over there. This is my SQL spaghetti, which is the original run, right? And so, so basically here the source data is there with like the output, because it's just, a dev database. And then when you're going to prod, basically you just specify, here it's MotherDuck. And if you have a MotherDuck token, you can sign up for free to MotherDuck. There is a feature. You put your token in the environment variable, and then you can switch basically to the cloud. So there is this clear, basically we're talking about developer experience, where it's actually much easier, nothing to sell, but like it's really hard to simulate a Snowflake locally, or BigQuery. BigQuery has an emulator to run locally, but it's really hard. And so just to show you, so if I run this, that will run around the data set, and of course it's not working because I'm opening the database at the moment, so there is a conflict. So let's run again. And it's done. So you see that was super fast, right? And we still had like some tables with millions row, if you remember. And basically the data set is now pushed to this. And if I want to inspect again, so this is my SQL by getting table. So this is the final table, which is not refactored, and then we have the other items detail, which was this one, right? Which was refactor using the different CTE. Yeah, that's roughly the same data set. Yeah, so that was it for it. There is so much things that we could do regarding refactoring, right? We're just, I think, scratching the surface, but still, one key thing that you would say, like, what's the easy thing people should definitely start thinking when refactoring? That's a no-brainer for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it probably goes back to separating the models out based on the stage. So having staging, intermediate, and core layers is really going to make things clean things up, especially if you've got like a couple thousand lines in a query. And then the CTEs, there's been some discussion in the comments about this, but yeah, like just naming CTEs, making it really clear on what your code is actually doing, so that people can follow along. Is sometimes writing the code in a way that's more readable is better than writing comments. So, yeah.
Yeah, because someone said the code is the documentation.
Yeah, exactly.
It's true. And there is a lot of debate. Like people say, yeah, your comment is gonna be out of date more quickly than your code, because often people update code but then non-update documentation or the comment. So that's true. Right. But I feel like it's a fine line to find, right? It's a fine line to find. Why are you, to finish on, why are you the most excited for in the next coming months in data for you, or just in general in the technology or the space?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think when we were talking about this earlier, like the kind of the AI piece, I think for me, it's like I'm interested to see that become more useful. Like I think right now, to me, it's like it's still very conversational. It's like you ask a question, you get a response back. Like I'm interested to see more of that turn into you can it can actually do things for you that are a little bit more automated. So I think just seeing it get applied in more useful ways is definitely going to be pretty impactful in the data space.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us. So Quack and Code is happening every other week. In 2 weeks, I will have another guest where we quack and code. Don't forget to go check out Lindsay, his podcast, right? Women Lead Data. It's an amazing initiative, and I was super happy to have you. I think we met. I didn't think we met in 101 virtually. We first met in person. Is that correct?
It was. I think it was at Coalesce last year.
Yeah. So it's a weird thing. I mean, we've been collaborating like async with the DS Fest, right? But so that's this weird moment where I actually saw Lindsay first in person and then online. So this also can happen. You see?
It's true. People do meet in real life sometimes.
Yeah. All right. Have a great day, evening, wherever you are.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll see you around.
Bye, everyone.